I remember when my hands were still my own. They tell you the soil is sacred. They tell you that every seed pressed into the earth is an offering to him on terra, that the sweat on your brow is incense rising to the golden throne, that your labor feeds not just the Imperium but the Emperor's own eternal vigilance. They tell you this in the communal chapel every seventh day, when the overseers count heads, and the circuit priest delivers his sermon through vox-corrupted speakers that make his voice sound like it's coming from the bottom of a well. They tell you this, and for 38 years, I believed it. I bent my back to the furrows. I trusted the rhythm of seasons that weren't really seasons, just production cycles marked by the shifting of work quotas and the rotation of crop strains. I raised my children to believe it too. I don't know if they still believe. I don't know if they're still alive. The Agri-World was called Throne's Bounty in all official documentation, though we just called it the Mud or sometimes the Green Hell when the overseers weren't listening. It was a planet given over entirely to the production of nutritional paste-grade grains, protein-rich tubers, and vitamin-supplemented moss that grew in the humid greenhouses. 14 billion souls lived there, spread across 7 continents, every one of us bent to the same purpose. The cities were processing facilities, their spires rising from the fields, like the fingers of a buried giant trying to claw its way out of the earth. The sky was perpetually overcast, a ceiling of grey clouds that trapped the heat and moisture until the very air felt like breathing soup. Rain came daily, regulated by orbital weather stations, each drop measured against agricultural efficiency reports. I inherited my plot from my father, who inherited it from his mother, who received it when the planetary colonial charter was first granted 600 years ago. Plot 44778, 3 Delta. 400 hectares of rich black soil, slightly acidic, optimal for the vermilion wheat strain that constituted our primary tithe. The boundaries were marked by rusted fence posts crowned with imperial aquilus, their wings spread in benediction or threat, depending on how the light caught them. My dwelling was a prefabricated hab unit, standard template construction, identical to every other farmstead hab on the planet. 4 rooms, corrugated metal roof, water reclamation unit, a shrine alcove for the Emperor's image. My wife kept the shrine clean. She said prayers there every morning before the work bell rang. The bell. Emperor. The bell. It rang at 0400 every morning, a harsh metallic clang broadcast from the Vox towers that dotted the landscape like iron trees. It rang, and you rose, and you worked. 16 hours in the fields during harvest season, 12 during planting, 8 minimum during the brief maintenance period, when the soil was being chemically treated and rebalanced. Your output was monitored by the cogitator scribes in the regional administrative center, your efficiency rated against your neighbors, your family, your ancestors. Fall below quota for 3 consecutive cycles, and you were transferred to the processing facilities. I never met anyone who came back from the facilities. My children were Kale and Mira. Stupid names, agricultural names, given to them because my wife had a sentimental streak she'd inherited from her own mother. Kale was 14 when it started, Mira 11. They worked the fields alongside us as soon as they could walk steady and carry a harvest bag. Child labor wasn't cruelty on Throne's bounty, it was economic necessity, encoded in the planetary charter, blessed by the ecclesiarchy, enforced by the adeptus arbites when anyone was foolish enough to protest. Children were assets. They increased household productivity. They learned the trade that would sustain them until they died, or were promoted to oversight duty if they were lucky and clever and ruthless enough. Kale was clever. He learned to read not just the grow cycle charts but the actual technical documentation, the stuff printed in the spidery Gothic script that most of us couldn't parse. He would spend his rest periods in the communal data vault, scrolling through agricultural treatises that were older than our bloodline, making notes on a battered data slate he'd traded for with a passing merchant. He asked questions that made me uncomfortable. Why did we grow only what the tithe assessors demanded? Why couldn't we rotate in crops that were better for the soil, even if they yielded less? Why did the nutrient profiles of our products keep declining even as our quotas kept increasing? I told him to stop asking. I told him that we served, and in serving we found purpose, and that purpose was sufficient. I told him what my father had told me, and what the circuit priest told us all, that the Imperium stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, that each world contributed according to its ability, that our grain fed the soldiers who held back the darkness at the galaxy's edge. I told him that individual concerns were meaningless before the vastness of that duty. He looked at me with 14-year-old eyes that had already seen too much and said, "But what if we could serve better?" I struck him. Not hard, but enough to sting. Enough to remind him that some questions were dangerous. His mother wept that night, quietly, in the corner of our hab where she thought I couldn't hear. Mira watched it all, and said nothing, her small face unreadable. 3 months later, the quota increased. It had increased before, of course. Quotas always increased. The Imperium's hunger was infinite, and we were taught that this was right and proper, that the Emperor's armies grew ever larger, that the number of mouths to feed multiplied beyond counting. But this increase was different, 30% above previous cycle, implemented with 2 weeks' notice, mandatory compliance. The regional overseer delivered the news via Vox broadcast, her voice flat and effectless as she read from the official decree. Failure to meet quota would result in immediate reclassification of the plot. No exceptions. No appeals. The Emperor protects, but he also demands 30%. We were already farming at maximum efficiency, every technique optimized, every hour utilized. The only way to meet the new quota was to expand to cultivate the marginal land at the plot's edges, the rocky slopes and clay-heavy depressions that had been left fallow because they were barely arable, or to push harder, work longer, sleep less, demand more from soil that was already exhausted, from bodies that were already breaking down. We pushed harder. The first thing I noticed was the smell, not the usual rich earth and manure smell of tilled fields, but something sharper, chemical. The administratum had authorized enhanced fertilizers, compounds synthesized off-world and shipped in bulk, stored in sealed drums, emblazoned with hazard runes. I couldn't read. The distribution center gave each farm their allotment based on hectare count, along with minimal instructions. Apply to topsoil at rate of 5 kilograms per hectare, irrigate immediately, avoid direct skin contact. The stuff was bright blue, almost luminous. It hissed when it touched moisture. It smelled like burning metal and spoiled fruit. We wore gloves when we spread it, but the gloves were cheap, synthetic, and they developed holes. The blue powder got under your fingernails. It stained your skin. Kale said it made his hands itch. Mira developed a rash on her forearms that wouldn't heal, angry red welts that wept clear fluid. But the crops grew. Emperor below. How they grew. The vermilion wheat shot up faster than I'd ever seen, stalks thick as a man's thumb, grain heads heavy and swollen. The protein tubers doubled in size, their flesh dense and pale. The moss in the greenhouses spread like a living carpet, choking out the spaces between growth trays. We made quota that cycle. We exceeded it by 7%. The regional overseer sent a commendation, a scrap of printed paper with an official seal, and the words, "Exemplary service," in high Gothic. My wife pinned it to the shrine wall. Kale's hands stopped itching. They started going numb instead. He noticed it first in the mornings, when he tried to grip his tools. His fingers wouldn't close properly, wouldn't respond the way they should. He dropped things. He couldn't make a fist. I told him it was fatigue, that we were all tired from the extended work hours, that it would pass. But it didn't pass. It spread. Within a week, the numbness had climbed to his wrists. Within 2 weeks, his elbows. I watched my son's arms turn into dead weight, watched him try to pick up a harvest bag with stiff, clumsy movements like a servitor with corrupted motor functions. We took him to the Medicae station in the nearest settlement, a 15-kilometer walk along the mud-rutted path that passed for a road. The Medicae was a sour-faced woman with augmetic eyes and no bedside manner. She examined Kale in silence, running a handheld auspex over his arms, consulting a data screen I couldn't see. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Peripheral nerve damage, chemical exposure, progressive and irreversible." I asked if there was treatment. She laughed, a single harsh bark of sound. "Treatment? On an agri-world? For a farmer?" She gestured to a poster on the wall, one of the standard administratum safety notices. "Report all industrial accidents within 24 hours for processing." She said, "You're 3 weeks late. Even if we had the resources, which we don't, the damage is done. He's 14, yes? He'll have full functionality loss in both arms within 6 months. After that, he's unfit for field labor." I asked what happened to people who were unfit for field labor. She didn't answer. She just stamped our medical report and filed it in her cogitator. We walked home. Kale didn't speak. Neither did I. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to tell him that in 6 months, he would be transferred to the processing facilities, where the unfit were rendered down into protein supplements to feed the same Imperium that had poisoned him. My wife wept when I told her. Mira listened with that same unreadable expression, and I stood there in our hab, staring at the commendation pinned to the shrine wall, wondering what I'd really been serving all these years. But we still had quota to meet. We still had fields to work. So we worked. Kale did what he could with failing arms. He learned to use harness straps to secure tools to his body, to manipulate equipment with his shoulders and back. He moved like a broken puppet, jerky and graceless, but he moved. He never complained. He never asked why. He just worked until the day he couldn't anymore, until his arms hung completely useless at his sides and the overseer's assistant came to collect him for reassignment. I watched them load my son into the transport. I watched him look back at me once, his face empty of everything except a kind of resigned understanding. Then the transport's rear doors closed, and he was gone. My wife stopped praying at the shrine. She took down the commendation and burned it in the heating unit. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than any accusation. Mira's rash had gotten worse, spreading to her neck, her face. She scratched at it constantly, leaving bloody tracks across her skin. I put the enhanced fertilizer away. I went back to the old methods, the slower methods, even though I knew it meant we'd fall below quota. We fell below quota. The notice came 2 cycles later. Plot 447783 Delta was underperforming. Efficiency had declined 18%. This was unacceptable. A productivity inspection would be conducted in 10 days. Corrective measures would be implemented. I knew what corrective measures meant. I'd seen it happen to other families. The administratum would seize the plot, absorb it into a larger collective farm operation run by servitors and wage laborers shipped in from off-world. We would be relocated, separated, most likely. My wife to a textile manufactorum, Mira to a youth labor corps, me to wherever they needed bodies for work too dangerous or degrading for anyone they valued. So I did something stupid. I did something desperate. I started using the enhanced fertilizer again, not just the authorized amount double, triple. I poured it on the fields like water, mixing it into irrigation channels, broadcasting it across every hectare. The smell became overwhelming, a miasma that clung to everything, that seeped into the hab walls and saturated our clothes. Mira started coughing, wet, ragged sounds that shook her small frame. My wife's hair began falling out in clumps. I felt my own hands growing numb, the same creeping deadness that had taken Kale. But the crops grew. Emperor's blood. The crops grew like nothing I'd ever seen. The wheat stalks were as thick as fence posts, the grain heads grotesque in their swollen abundance. The tubers erupted from the ground, splitting their skins, oozing milky sap. The moss crawled out of the greenhouses, spreading across the walls of the hab, across the shrine, across everything. It grew so fast I could watch it move, tendrils extending, spreading, consuming. We made quota. We exceeded it by 40%. The productivity inspection came and went. The overseer's representative took one look at our yield numbers, ran a few perfunctory scans, and departed with a curt nod of approval. We were exemplary again. Efficient. Valuable. My wife died 3 days later. Just collapsed in the fields, her heart giving out, her body finally refusing to continue. I buried her at the edge of the plot, in the rocky ground where nothing grew, and I marked the grave with a fence post Aquila. Mira stood beside me, her face covered in the rash, her breath wheezing through congested lungs, and she asked me why. Why we did this. Why we kept doing this. Why we poisoned ourselves to feed people we'd never meet, on worlds whose names we didn't know, in service to an emperor who couldn't possibly know or care that we existed. I told her what I'd told Kale. I told her we served. I told her service was sufficient. She looked at me with 11-year-old eyes and said, "That's not an answer." She was right. It wasn't an answer. It was just the only thing I had left. The moss kept spreading. It covered the hab completely now, a living skin of green-grey vegetation that pulsed with its own wet vitality. It grew into the cracks around the windows, the gaps under the door. It produced these fruiting bodies, bulbous things that swelled and burst, releasing clouds of spores that made the air thick and hard to breathe. I tried to cut it back, but it grew faster than I could clear it, and I needed to work the fields. I needed to meet quota. I needed to serve. Mira's coughing got worse. She started coughing up blood, bright arterial red mixed with something else, something dark and fibrous. The Medicae station was gone. The sour-faced woman had been transferred, replaced by a servitor medical unit that could only dispense standard-issue pain suppressants and anti-infection unguents. I carried Mira there anyway. The servitor scanned her with dead augmetic eyes and declared her condition within acceptable parameters for Agri-World labor operations. It dispensed a week's worth of suppressants and sent us away. She lasted another month. Toward the end, she couldn't move without help. The rash had spread until it covered nearly her entire body, the skin cracked and weeping. Her breathing was a constant labored wheeze. She spent her days lying on her cot, staring at the moss-covered ceiling, sometimes whispering things I couldn't understand. One morning, I went to check on her and found something that wasn't quite my daughter anymore. The moss had grown over her in the night. It covered her like a blanket, like a shroud, tendrils woven through her hair, across her face, into her mouth and nostrils. She was still breathing. I could see the rise and fall of her chest beneath the green mass, but she wasn't conscious. And when I tried to pull the moss away, to free her, I found that it had rooted into her skin. The tendrils had pushed through her pores, had burrowed into her flesh, had become part of her. I stood there with my hands shaking, my numb, useless hands, and I finally understood. We weren't farming the land. The land was farming us. Every generation of my family had worked this plot. Every generation had breathed the air, touched the soil, ingested trace amounts of whatever engineered compounds the administratum had authorized for use. Every generation had absorbed it into their bodies, had become part of the ecosystem, had fed back into it when they died and were buried in the earth. We weren't separate from the crops. We were another crop, another resource, another source of biological material to be processed and redistributed according to the Imperium's needs. The enhanced fertilizer wasn't meant to help the plants. It was meant to help break us down faster, to accelerate the process, to make us more useful. I could have stopped. I could have walked away from the plot, abandoned it, sought refuge in one of the processing cities. But where would I go? What would I do? And how long before the Arbeits caught me, classified me as a deserter, a shirker, unfit for labor, and therefore unfit for life? There was no escape. There was no world in the Imperium where I could exist except as a tool, a resource, a body to be used until it broke. So I kept working. Mira died still wrapped in moss. I couldn't bury her, the ground was too saturated, and I was afraid of what might grow from her. So I left her in the hab, let the moss take her completely, watched as her form gradually disappeared beneath the green mass. Within a week, there There was no sign that a girl had ever lain there, just moss, just more growth. I was alone now, alone with the fields, with the crops, with the endless cycle of planting and harvesting and meeting quota. My hands were completely numb, my arms were losing function. It took me twice as long to do anything, and the work was killing me in increments too small to notice until I looked back and saw how far I'd fallen. The tithe assessors came as scheduled. They measured our yield, calculated our efficiency rating, updated their cogitator records. We'd met quota. We'd exceeded it, in fact, despite being down to a single operator. The lead assessor, a thin man with ritual scarification across his forehead, actually commended me. He said my dedication was exemplary. He said I represented the best of imperial citizenry. He said the emperor himself smiled upon such service. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to wrap my numb hands around his throat and squeeze until something broke. But I didn't. I just nodded and accepted the commendation and watched him leave. That night, I sat in the moss-covered hab and tried to remember what my wife's face had looked like. Tried to remember Kale's voice, Mira's laugh. Tried to remember a time when I'd believed that this mattered, that this meant something, that the service we rendered was noble and necessary and worthy of the cost. I couldn't remember. Those memories were as numb as my hands. The moss was growing on me now. I could feel it, or rather, I could feel the absence of feeling as it crept across my skin. It started on my hands, where the chemical exposure had been worst, covering the stained blue skin with soft green fuzz. Then it spread to my arms, my chest, my neck. It didn't hurt. It didn't feel like anything. It just was. I kept working. What else could I do? The fields needed tending. The crops needed harvesting. The quota needed meeting. I moved through my tasks like a servitor, mechanical and unthinking, because thinking meant acknowledging what was happening, and I couldn't afford to acknowledge it. I had to work. I had to serve. The circuit priest came for his monthly sermon. He stood at the edge of my plot, refusing to approach the hab, refusing to touch anything. He looked at me with undisguised revulsion and began his standard liturgy. The faithful serve, and in service find redemption. The emperor watches, and his gaze is mercy. The Imperium endures, and we endure within it. I asked him a question. My voice came out wrong, muffled by the moss that had grown across my lips, but he heard me. I asked him what happened to the grain we produced, where it went, who ate it. He looked at me like I'd committed blasphemy. It feeds the Imperium, he said. That knowledge should be sufficient. But specifically, I pressed. Where? He hesitated. Then he said, it's processed into nutrient paste, shipped to Forge Worlds, Hive cities, naval vessels, distributed according to need. That's all anyone requires to know. Do they know where it comes from? I asked. Do they know what's in it? His face darkened. Your questions border on heresy. Do they know, I repeated, that they're eating us? He left without finishing his sermon. He didn't come back. The harvest that cycle was the best we'd ever produced. The yield numbers were astronomical. The grain was dense with nutrients, the tubers rich with proteins and fats, the moss packed with vitamins and minerals. I shipped it all to the regional collection center. I watched the transport trucks haul it away, crate after crate after crate of food that had been grown in poisoned soil, fertilized with corrupted chemicals, harvested by a farmer who was more plant than man. I wondered who would eat it. Soldiers on some distant battlefield? Factory workers in a manufactorum? Ordinary citizens of the Imperium? People with families and hopes and lives, ingesting the rendered-down remnants of my wife, my children, my ancestors, myself, passing our atoms through their bodies, shitting us out, unknowing and uncaring, while the cycle continued. I wondered if it mattered. The numbness had spread to my face now. I couldn't speak anymore, couldn't form words with a mouth that was filling with moss. My vision was going, green tendrils creeping across my eyes, but I could still move. I could still work. And that was what mattered, wasn't it? The work, the service, the endless, grinding, meaningless service to an imperium that would consume me and everyone I'd ever loved and never once acknowledge that we'd existed. I thought about Cale's question, the one that had started all of this. What if we could serve better? This was the answer. This was how we served better. By giving everything. By becoming the product ourselves. By accepting that we were resources, raw materials, biomass to be processed and redistributed. By embracing the grotesque efficiency of a system that had calculated, somewhere in the vast computational engines of the administratum, that it was more cost-effective to work farmers to death and render their bodies into fertilizer than to maintain them as long-term productive assets. It was brilliant in its way. Horrifying, but brilliant. No waste. No inefficiency. Every atom of our being repurposed, recycled, fed back into the machine. The circuit priest would call it redemption. I called it what it was, consumption. The moss covered me completely now. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel anything except the slow vegetative pulse of growth. I was still aware, somehow my mind trapped in a body that wasn't mine anymore, that had become something else. I could sense the fields around me, sense the other plots, sense the vast agricultural sprawl of the entire continent. And I could sense something else, something I'd never noticed before because I'd never been part of it. I could sense the others, the other farmers who'd been taken by the moss, who'd become part of the growth. They were there, in the soil, in the plants, in the very air. Hundreds of them, thousands, generations of workers who'd believed they were serving the Imperium when really they were just feeding it. We were all there, all connected, all part of the same vast organism that had been engineered deliberately. I understood now to convert human biomass into agricultural product. This was the truth they didn't tell you in the administratum charters. This was the secret encoded in the planetary development plans, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and need-to-know clearances. The Agri-Worlds weren't just food production facilities, they were processing centers. They took in humans, and they produced nutrients. Everything else was justification, ideology, the stories we told ourselves to make the grinding acceptable. And the worst part? It worked. The system worked. We'd met quota. We'd exceeded it. My plot would remain productive for centuries, fertilized by my family's remains, worked by whoever the administratum assigned to replace me. The chain would continue. The service would endure. The Imperium would feed on our bones and call it holy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage against it, to reject it, to find some way to make it stop. But I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything. I was moss now. I was part of the soil. I was the crop. The last thing I thought, before my consciousness finally dissolved into the green, was this. They tell you that service is sufficient. They tell you that duty brings meaning. They tell you that the individual is nothing before the vastness of the Imperium's needs. They're right, but they never tell you what that actually means. They never tell you that nothing isn't metaphor. It's literal. It's prophecy. You serve until you're nothing, and then you keep serving. And the Imperium grinds on, eternal and hungry, consuming worlds and spitting out quota reports. My name was. I had a name. I know I had a name. It's written somewhere, in some cogitator file, in some administratum record, plot 447783 Delta, operator ID number, productivity rating, cause of death, irrelevant, status, replaced. The wheat grows tall, the tubers grow fat, the moss spreads across the hab, across the fields, across everything. Next cycle's harvest will be exceptional. The tithe assessors will be pleased. The Imperium will be fed. And somewhere, on some distant world, someone will open a ration pack and consume a meal made from the processed remnants of everything I was, everyone I loved, everything we sacrificed in service to an emperor who never knew our names. They'll taste nothing unusual, just standard nutrient paste, maybe a little bitter, but acceptable. sufficient. The soil is sacred, they say. They're right about that much. It's sacred because it's full of us. Full of everyone who believed the lies, who trusted the system, who thought that service meant something more than being slowly digested by the Imperium's endless hunger. I remember when my hands were still my own. I remember. The wheat grows tall,